Before we begin today's story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world right now. I always love imagining these stories reaching different homes, different cities, and different hearts at different hours of the day. Eleanor Whitmore used to believe that if a woman lived with decency long enough, life would eventually return that decency to her. At 70 years old, she no longer believed that. On cold mornings, when the house was still quiet and the expensive coffee machine in the kitchen had not yet begun its hissing performance, Eleanor often stood by the window with both hands wrapped around a plain ceramic mug and looked out over the manicured hedges of her son's suburban home. The neighborhood in Connecticut was the kind that looked perfect from the outside: stone driveways, polished shutters, seasonal wreaths on every door, and lawns cut so evenly they seemed to belong in a magazine rather than real life. It was the kind of place Richard Whitmore would have admired for exactly 5 minutes before saying something practical. "Too much grass," her late husband would have muttered. "A man spends half his life mowing just to impress people who don't care." That memory still made Eleanor smile, though the smile never lasted very long. Richard had been dead for 6 years. Before illness hollowed him out, he had been a school principal in a small Massachusetts town, a firm but kind man with a voice that could silence a room full of unruly teenagers without ever needing to rise above calm authority. He had believed in order, honesty, pressed shirts, balanced checkbooks, and the importance of eating dinner at the table as a family, no matter how hard the day had been. And for many years, Eleanor had shared that life with him gladly. They had not been wealthy, not even close, but their home had once been full of something money could not imitate: warmth. Real warmth, the sort that came from long habits, inside jokes, dependable routines, and sacrifices made without resentment. Eleanor had been the kind of woman who remembered birthdays without a calendar, who mended hems by hand rather than throwing clothes away, who could stretch a roast chicken into 3 meals without making anyone feel poor. She and Richard had only one child, Daniel. He had been the center of their world from the moment he arrived, squalling and red-faced on a stormy April night. Richard had held the baby with the same solemn expression he wore when taking oaths at school assemblies, then looked at Eleanor and whispered, "We're going to give him everything we never had." And they had tried. Eleanor still remembered Daniel as a boy with restless brown hair and scraped knees, a child who brought home frogs in his pockets and cried when a sparrow hit the kitchen window. He had once clung to her skirt on his first day of school and asked, "You'll still be here when I come back, won't you?" "Always," she had told him. At the time, she meant it as comfort. She had no idea that one day she would become the one asking that question in silence, only to discover that some promises survive only in one direction. Daniel had grown up into a bright young man, clever, handsome, ambitious in the polished modern way that made adults nod approvingly and say, "He's going places." Richard had glowed with pride when Daniel was accepted into law school. Eleanor had cried in the kitchen after the letter arrived, not because she was sentimental, but because tuition numbers sat on the page like a threat. They were not prepared. Richard's principal's salary and Eleanor's modest part-time work at the public library had never created much room for savings. Still, neither of them hesitated. Eleanor sold a bracelet her mother had left her. Richard took on consulting work during the summer. They refinanced the house once, then again when Daniel's first semester costs climbed higher than expected. "Maybe I should take a year off," Daniel had said once, though even then the words came out half-hearted, as if he hoped his parents would refuse. Richard had straightened in his chair. "No, you finish what you start." Eleanor had reached across the table and squeezed her son's hand. "Your father's right. We'll manage." And they had. Or at least they had managed well enough for Daniel never to see the full ugliness of what it cost. He never knew Eleanor had skipped her own dental work for 2 years. He never knew Richard had hidden chest pains for months because he refused to spend money on specialists while tuition bills kept arriving. He never knew the electricity had almost been shut off one winter, until Eleanor begged for an extension over the phone in a whisper so he would not hear from upstairs. Parents were good at disguising suffering when they thought it would help their children rise. For a while, it seemed worth it. Daniel did well in law school. He met people with family money, expensive watches, and casual confidence. He learned how to shape his voice into something cooler, smoother, less provincial. Eleanor noticed the change long before Richard did. Daniel no longer spoke about becoming a public defender or helping ordinary families navigate their troubles. He began talking about firms, prestige, clients with power. "It's the real world, Mom," he said one Thanksgiving when she gently asked whether he still cared about the things he used to care about. "No one survives by being idealistic forever." Richard had looked up from carving the turkey. "There's surviving, and then there's selling your soul. Don't confuse the two." Daniel laughed then, but it was the tight laugh of someone who already considered himself more modern than the people who raised him. Eleanor told herself that ambition was not a crime. Youth changed people. Cities changed them too. Still, the first time Daniel brought Vanessa home, something in Eleanor's chest tightened with an instinct she could not explain. Vanessa was beautiful in the clean, deliberate way of women who always seemed recently polished. Her blonde hair fell in a sheet so perfect it looked expensive. Her smile was precise. Her handshake was cool and brief. She wore a cream coat that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly grocery budget had once been. At dinner, Vanessa looked around the Whitmore dining room with polite interest, taking in the old china cabinet, the worn oak table, the framed school photos of Daniel through the years. "This house has character," she said. It sounded like a compliment, but Eleanor heard the translation underneath. Old, small, unfashionable. Richard, bless him, heard it too. "It has history," he replied, pouring water into her glass. "Character comes and goes. History has to be earned." Vanessa smiled without blinking. "That's one way to see it." Daniel jumped in quickly, talking too much, laughing too loudly, eager to smooth over tensions no one had named. Eleanor watched him that evening with a mother's painful clarity. He was not in love with Vanessa because she made him feel peaceful. He was in love with what being chosen by her seemed to say about him. After she left, Richard loosened his tie and said, "That girl does not step into rooms, she audits them." Eleanor tried to be fair. Maybe she was nervous. Richard gave her a look. So was Napoleon, I imagine. Despite her husband's distrust, the relationship moved quickly. Vanessa came from money, real money, though not the theatrical billionaire kind. Her father owned commercial properties in 3 states. Her mother chaired boards and hosted fundraising luncheons where people spoke of compassion while wearing diamonds large enough to distract from it. Daniel seemed intoxicated by their world. His clothes improved. His haircuts became more expensive. He began correcting Eleanor's grammar in subtle ways and rolling his eyes when Richard spoke too bluntly about politics or work. Then came Daniel's first business failure. He had left a respectable legal track to join a boutique venture with 2 classmates who promised quick growth and bigger returns. It collapsed within 18 months. Loans were called in. Creditors circled. Vanessa, who was engaged to him by then, did not leave, but she made it very clear she had no intention of lowering her standards for his sake. "This is temporary." Daniel insisted one evening at his parents' house, pacing the living room while rain tapped the windows. "I just need breathing room, a reset." Richard's jaw tightened. "You need discipline." "I need support," Daniel snapped. Eleanor stepped between them before pride could harden into damage. "How much?" Silence. Then Daniel named the number. Richard actually sat back as if struck. That's not breathing room, that's disaster. But Eleanor looked at her son's face and saw panic beneath the anger. Not the panic of a child anymore, but of a man terrified that the future he had advertised to the world was about to collapse in front of witnesses. "We still have the house," she said quietly. Richard turned to her. "Eleanor." She knew what that one word meant. It meant no. It meant enough. It meant we have already given more than we could afford. But she also knew what it meant to be a mother. The second mortgage went through 3 weeks later. Richard did not speak much the day they signed the papers. He drove home in silence, both hands fixed on the steering wheel. That night, after Daniel had called to say thank you in a voice so relieved it was almost cheerful, Richard sat at the kitchen table long after midnight. "He'll never understand what this cost," he said. Eleanor folded a dish towel carefully. "Maybe one day he will." Richard looked at her with tired eyes. "You always believe that." She had. For years she had. When Richard's health began to fail not long after, the cost of all those years seemed to come due at once. The stress, the extra work, the refusal to slow down. Perhaps none of it caused the heart attack outright, but Eleanor never stopped believing they helped lay the road toward it. In the hospital, Daniel arrived in a tailored coat, Vanessa beside him, both looking shocked in the orderly, well-groomed way of people unaccustomed to illness entering their schedule. Richard, pale against white sheets, motioned weakly for Daniel to come closer. "Take care of your mother," he said. Daniel swallowed. "Of course." Richard turned his eyes toward Eleanor. Even then, even breathless, there had been apology in them. Not because he had failed to love her, but because he was leaving her in a world that had grown colder than either of them expected. After the funeral, the house felt too large for one grieving woman and too expensive for one shrinking income. Daniel was attentive at first. He called often. Vanessa sent flowers with elegant cards signed in smooth black ink. Then came the reasonable suggestions. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom. It's too much house for you now. Why don't you stay with us for a while until things settle?" Eleanor said yes, because grief makes even intelligent people mistake convenience for kindness. She packed her life into labeled boxes: Richard's books, old Christmas ornaments, photo albums, the blue wool blanket Daniel had used as a child. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself families pulled together in hard times. She told herself she had done the same for others all her life. The day she locked the front door of her own home for the last time, she stood on the porch longer than necessary, staring at the hydrangeas she had planted 15 summers earlier. "You'll be all right," Daniel said, loading the final box into his car. Eleanor nodded and forced a smile. Yes, of course. But as she looked back at the house where she had been wife, mother, hostess, nurse, cook, and keeper of memory, a strange fear brushed past her. It felt, though she could not yet prove it, less like she was leaving home and more like she was stepping out of the last place in the world where she had still been fully herself. Before we continue today's story, take a second to share where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. There is something strangely comforting knowing that while one story unfolds here, so many different lives are quietly listening from across the world. The first months in Daniel and Vanessa's house did not seem unbearable. That is how it began. Not with open cruelty, but with small rearrangements of dignity so subtle they might almost have passed for practicality. Saying the stairs would be difficult for Eleanor at her age. The room was neat enough, with pale walls, a bed too firm for her liking, and a small window facing the side hedge. It was not offensive. It simply did not feel as though it belonged to someone meant to stay with affection. It felt temporary, like a room prepared for a relative no one expected to become part of the rhythm of the home. Eleanor told herself not to be ungrateful. When Daniel left for work in the mornings, he still kissed her cheek. "You all right, Mom?" "Yes," she always answered, because what else was there to say? That the house was too quiet in all the wrong ways? That the silence here felt arranged rather than peaceful? That every object seemed selected not for comfort, but for display? Vanessa ran the house like someone managing a boutique hotel she did not personally wish to live in. Fresh flowers appeared every Friday. Towels were folded with exact edges. Kitchen counters gleamed. Nothing sentimental was left in sight. There were no children's drawings, no messy stacks of books, no worn blankets tossed casually over the backs of chairs. It was a beautiful home in the way a showroom was beautiful, impressive, expensive, and faintly hostile to human weakness. At first, Vanessa was careful. She spoke with smooth civility, always using Eleanor's name in a tone so polished it disguised what was absent underneath. "Eleanor, would you mind signing for a package if I'm in the shower?" "Eleanor, could you keep an eye on the roast? I'll be on a call." "Eleanor, since you're home anyway, perhaps you could let the cleaners in at noon." The requests were small, reasonable even. Eleanor did not object. She had never been the sort of woman to sit idle while younger people rushed around her. Helping made her feel less like a burden. For a while, she even convinced herself that Vanessa's briskness was simply personality rather than contempt. Then the boundaries shifted. A week became a month, and a month became 3. Without discussion, Eleanor's place in the house quietly changed. She began unloading groceries, sorting laundry, accepting deliveries, and reheating dinners when Daniel and Vanessa returned late. She watered the indoor plants, signed birthday cards Vanessa forgot to mail, and ironed table linens for dinners she was never invited to join. None of it was announced as duty. It was simply assumed, absorbed into the atmosphere of the home until refusing would have seemed churlish. One afternoon, while folding napkins in the kitchen, Vanessa overheard Eleanor speaking on the phone in the next room. "No, she's still here," Vanessa said, laughing softly. "Daniel says it's temporary, but you know how guilt works on people like him. Honestly, it's like inheriting furniture you can't throw out because it belonged to the family." The words entered Eleanor, not like a knife, but like cold water sliding under a locked door. She stood very still, one napkin half folded in her hands. Vanessa continued, her voice dropping with amused disdain. "No, she doesn't cause scenes. That would almost be easier. She just hovers, quietly, looking wounded all the time. It's exhausting." Eleanor finished folding the napkin, then the next one, then the next. When Vanessa entered the kitchen a few minutes later, Eleanor did not mention what she had heard. Vanessa glanced at the neat stack on the counter. "Thank you," she said lightly. "You do have an eye for domestic things." It was meant to sound complimentary. Instead, it felt like being placed in a category below the human one. At first, Daniel noticed nothing, or pretended not to. Eleanor could not decide which possibility hurt more. He was busy rebuilding his reputation after the humiliating collapse of his first business venture. He had joined a rising firm in New York, commuted long hours, and returned home carrying tension in his shoulders like a permanent garment. He spoke often of clients, strategy, positioning, and the importance of keeping certain circles impressed. Vanessa understood that language perfectly. She had begun hosting small dinners. Investors, legal associates, philanthropy board members, and wealthy couples who smiled too brightly and never truly listened to anyone outside their own class. Eleanor learned quickly that on those evenings she was expected to disappear. "Tonight is important," Vanessa said one Thursday while reviewing menus with the caterer. "Nothing personal, of course, but it's easier if the household looks streamlined." The household? Eleanor repeated. Vanessa, without looking up, smiled faintly. You know what I mean. Eleanor did know. From then on, whenever guests came, she was asked to remain in her room or use the rear entrance if she needed something from the kitchen. Once, when she came out early and encountered two of Vanessa's friends in the hallway, Vanessa introduced her with airy vagueness. This is Eleanor. She's staying with us for a while. Not my mother-in-law, not family, simply an unexplained elderly woman made to sound like a temporary arrangement. That night, after the guests had left and Daniel was loosening his tie in the kitchen, Eleanor said quietly, "You know, it would not have killed her to say who I am." Daniel looked tired before she even finished the sentence. "Mom, must everything become a thing?" Eleanor stared at him. Everything? He rubbed his forehead. Vanessa didn't mean anything by it. She was distracted. No, Eleanor said softly. She was careful. Daniel exhaled as if he were the injured party. You're reading too much into these moments. Eleanor wanted to tell him that there comes an age when a person no longer misreads contempt because she has already met it too many times, but she said nothing. Silence had begun to feel like the tax she paid for staying under his roof. Winter came, then spring. By the second year, the mask had dropped further. Vanessa no longer bothered to dress her expectations in courtesy. She criticized Eleanor's cooking, though Eleanor was usually reheating meals Vanessa herself had ordered. She complained that the house smelled old when Eleanor used lavender soap. She instructed her not to sit in the formal living room because sunlight through the windows made the upholstery fade unevenly. She corrected the way Eleanor folded blankets, loaded the dishwasher, and arranged flowers in vases, all with the cool authority of someone who considered age inferior to taste. Daniel's response remained the same: avoidance. If Eleanor mentioned anything, he deflected. She's under pressure. She's intense with everyone. You know how she is. But Eleanor had begun to understand something terrible about her son. He was not blind. He was weak. He saw more than he admitted, but he had built his adult life so thoroughly around pleasing Vanessa and preserving his image that he would permit almost any private wrong as long as it did not disturb the surface of his public world. Then came Marta. She arrived as a housekeeper hired twice a week, small, capable, soft-spoken, in her 50s, with kind eyes and an accent that reminded Eleanor faintly of old church friends from Worcester. Marta was from Poland and had worked in many homes wealthier than this one. She understood domestic hierarchy at a glance. On her third morning in the house, she found Eleanor scrubbing dried candle wax from silver trays after one of Vanessa's events. "You should leave this for me," Marta said. "I'm helping." Eleanor smiled faintly. Helping is when someone asks with respect. The sentence landed gently, but it stayed. Over the next months, Marta became the first person in the house who saw Eleanor clearly. They drank tea in the kitchen mornings when Vanessa was out. They traded stories about late husbands, adult children, rising prices, old recipes. Marta never asked intrusive questions, but she noticed everything. One afternoon, she said, "In rich houses, cruelty is usually very quiet. That is how it hides." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "Sometimes quiet cruelty is the hardest to prove." Marta nodded. "But the person living it always knows." The breaking point came in the third year. Vanessa had been preparing for a major charity dinner for weeks. It was the kind of evening she loved most: camera-ready philanthropy, expensive wine, strategic introductions, and the performance of compassion in front of people whose names could open doors. She wore a silver gown that night and diamonds at her ears. Daniel had spent the entire day fielding calls and making sure the guest list included exactly the right blend of power and glamour. "Please," Vanessa told Eleanor that afternoon, standing in the kitchen with manicured fingers resting on the marble island, Stay in your room once guests arrive, unless I specifically ask for something. Tonight must be flawless." Eleanor, already tired, simply nodded. But the evening became chaotic. One of the servers failed to appear, a dessert order arrived late, Vanessa snapped at everyone in reach, moving through the house like beauty sharpened into a blade. Eleanor stayed out of sight until close to 10, when hunger and dizziness finally pushed her to step out for a glass of water. She thought the guests had moved to the terrace. Instead, as she entered the edge of the dining room hallway, conversation paused. A cluster of elegantly dressed people turned. Someone smiled awkwardly. Someone else looked away. Vanessa, holding a champagne flute, froze for half a second before recovering with terrifying speed. "Eleanor," she said, in a voice sweet enough to curdle milk, "I thought I had made myself clear." "I only came for water," Eleanor answered. The room had gone too still. Vanessa crossed to her, still smiling for the benefit of others. "Then use the kitchen entrance. Honestly, why do you insist on making these evenings harder than they already are?" Daniel stood by the fireplace. Their eyes met. For one dreadful second, Eleanor thought he might speak. He did not. Humiliation rose in her throat like heat. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her ears burning, her hands unsteady. Behind her, conversation slowly resumed, a little too loudly, the way people speak when pretending not to notice cruelty they have no intention of challenging. In the kitchen, Eleanor stood gripping the sink until her knuckles whitened. She could hear the muffled rhythm of laughter from the dining room. Her stomach twisted, not only from hunger, but from the knowledge that in a house where she had given labor, silence, and years, she was still considered an intrusion. Near midnight, after the guests were finally gone, Vanessa entered the kitchen in bare feet, carrying a half-cleared dinner plate. Her face had lost its public brightness. What remained was irritation, cold and naked. "You embarrassed me tonight," she said. Eleanor turned slowly. "By wanting water?" "By appearing." Vanessa set the plate down on the counter. "There are evenings when people like us have to maintain a standard." "People like us?" Eleanor repeated, almost to herself. Vanessa's mouth thinned. "Do not start." Something inside Eleanor, something old, tired, and too long pressed down, rose at last. "I have tolerated more in this house than you know. I lost my husband. I lost my home. I have lived here quietly and asked for almost nothing." Vanessa laughed without warmth. "You have lived here at our expense." At that moment, Daniel walked in. He looked between them, alarmed. "What's going on?" Eleanor turned toward her son. "You tell me." But before he could answer, Vanessa lifted the plate of scraped leftovers, cold roast, collapsed vegetables, sauce smeared across porcelain, and in one brutal motion tipped it onto the polished kitchen floor at Eleanor's feet. The wet sound seemed impossibly loud. Then Vanessa said with terrible calm, "If you insist on living like a dependent, then perhaps you should eat like one too, right there, on the floor, where beggars belong." For a second, no one moved. Eleanor looked down at the spilled food, then up at Daniel. His face changed. Shame flickered there. Shock, too. But he still did not step between them. He did not tell his wife to stop. He did not pick up his mother and lead her out. He just stood there, suspended inside the cowardice that had defined him for years. And in that silence, Eleanor understood something final. Vanessa's cruelty was monstrous, but Daniel's silence was the grave in which that cruelty had been allowed to grow. Before we continue, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your city right now. Stories like this always feel different depending on the hour. Some sound heavier at midnight, while others feel almost like justice when heard in the morning. For a long, suspended moment after Vanessa dumped the leftovers onto the kitchen floor, the world seemed ghost silence.
Eleanor did not cry immediately. What she felt first was not even pain, but a strange stillness, as if something inside her had at last become too exhausted to break any further. The roast lay in greasy pieces against the white tile. A smear of dark sauce ran toward the leg of the table. One green bean had landed beside the toe of her shoe. It was such a small, ugly detail, yet years later she would still remember that single green bean more clearly than Vanessa's face, because humiliation often fastens itself to the smallest things. Daniel took one step forward at last, his voice thin and shaken. "Vanessa."
But even then, it was not a rebuke. It was barely a protest. It was the weak sound of a man startled by the fact that cruelty had gone fully visible in front of him. Vanessa folded her arms. What? She wants to act wounded every time I ask for the bare minimum? The bare minimum, Eleanor repeated softly. Her own voice startled her. It sounded calm, far calmer than she felt. Vanessa let out a brittle laugh. You've been living under our roof for years. We feed you, house you, clean up after you. Marta appeared in the doorway just then, still wearing her coat, having returned for the scarf she had forgotten near the back entrance. She stopped when she saw the floor, the plate, Eleanor standing rigid beside the sink, and Daniel frozen in the middle of the room like a coward caught too late. What happened here? Marta asked. No one answered. Then Marta, who had worked in enough wealthy homes to recognize evil when she saw it, understood without needing explanation. She stepped forward, picked up a clean dish towel from the counter, and quietly placed it in Eleanor's trembling hand. No mother should be treated like this, she said. Vanessa's head snapped toward her. This is not your concern. Marta turned to her with a look so steady it cut deeper than a scream. Everything becomes my concern when I see a person being stripped of dignity. Vanessa opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the sharp sound of the front doorbell split the tension. All four of them looked toward the hallway. At that hour, no one should have been arriving. Daniel frowned. Were you expecting anyone? Vanessa's irritation deepened. Of course not. The bell rang again, longer this time. Then came a knock, firm, deliberate, not the uncertain knock of a neighbor or delivery driver, but the confident knock of someone who had no intention of being ignored. Daniel moved toward the foyer. Vanessa followed him, muttering under her breath. Marta remained where she was, one hand hovering protectively near Eleanor's elbow. From the kitchen doorway, Eleanor could not see the front entrance directly, but she heard it open, heard the pause that followed, heard Daniel say in a confused, formal voice, "Can I help you?" A second voice answered, male, deep, controlled, unmistakably educated, older. "I believe you can. I am looking for my sister." Something happened inside Eleanor then. Not recognition exactly, but shock moving so quickly through memory that her body understood before her mind did. Sister. No one had called her that in decades. She stepped into the hallway. Beyond Daniel's shoulder stood two men in dark suits, discreet but alert, clearly some form of private security. Through the open door, parked beneath the exterior lights of the Whitmore driveway, stood a long black limousine, polished so dark it reflected the cold night like water. And at the center of it all, standing with one gloved hand resting lightly on a silver-topped cane, was Alexander Whitmore. Time did not merely pass in Eleanor's life, it collided. Her younger brother had once been fast laughter, impatient intelligence, and dangerous charm. He had been the son their father called brilliant, and their mother called impossible. In youth, Alexander could make enemies in a minute and friends in 30 seconds, often in the same room. He had left America before turning 30, chasing finance, opportunity, and the kind of restless ambition that did not fit inside the life the family had known. Now he stood before her silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a dark overcoat, tailored so well it seemed cut from authority itself. Age had sharpened rather than softened him. His face bore the marks of years, but not defeat. He looked like a man who had learned how to survive powerful rooms by becoming more powerful than any room he entered. For one stunned moment, neither sibling moved. Then Alexander's gaze shifted past Daniel and Vanessa and landed fully on Eleanor. Everything in his face changed. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but enough. Shock, anger, grief. Then something quieter and more devastating. Shame. "My God," he said. The words were barely above a whisper. Eleanor did not know whether to step forward or backward. 25 years of silence stood between them. 25 years born from bitterness, misunderstanding, pride, and the poison of old family wounds that had never properly healed. There had been letters once, or at least she had believed there were, harsh words from lawyers, confusion over their father's estate, documents she had been told Alexander pushed through without fairness. Then Richard's pride, her own hurt, and the slow calcification of estrangement. After enough years, silence hardens into identity. She had built a life around the fact that she no longer had a brother. And yet, here he was. "Eleanor," he said again, more steadily this time. Vanessa found her voice first. "I'm sorry, but this is highly inappropriate. It's nearly midnight." Alexander did not look at her. Daniel straightened, uncertain whether to sound defensive or impressed. "I'm Daniel Whitmore, Eleanor's son." Only then did Alexander glance at him. His eyes were pale and cutting. "Yes," he said, "I know exactly who you are." There was nothing loud in the sentence, but Daniel took an involuntary step back. Vanessa, recovering herself, inserted a smile polished for strangers. "I'm Vanessa, Daniel's wife. I think there must be some misunderstanding. Eleanor wasn't expecting." Again, Alexander ignored her. He stepped into the house, his gaze still fixed on his sister. As he drew nearer, he saw what distance had hidden, the trembling in her hands, the stain of sauce near the hem of her skirt, the dish towel clutched too tightly in her fingers, and behind her, on the kitchen floor, the unmistakable remains of a meal thrown down rather than served. He stopped. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. "Who did this?" he asked. No one answered. Daniel opened his mouth, then shut it. Vanessa folded her arms. "This is a family matter." Alexander turned toward them, and for the first time, Eleanor saw what decades in international finance must have taught him: how to destroy arrogance without raising his voice. "No, what I am looking at is not a family matter. It is evidence of moral failure." Vanessa gave a disbelieving laugh. "You cannot walk into someone else's home and start making accusations." "I can, when this someone else's home belongs to the people humiliating my sister." That word again. Sister. Eleanor felt suddenly unsteady. Marta moved nearer, quietly offering support without intruding. Alexander noticed her and inclined his head in silent acknowledgement, as if he already understood she was the only decent witness in the room. Daniel tried at last to regain control. "Listen, this isn't what it looks like." Alexander's gaze cut back to him. "Then you are even more pitiful than it looks." Daniel flushed. "You don't know anything about what's been happening here." "No," said Alexander. "Let us begin with what I do know. I know I spent years trying to locate Eleanor after discovering that certain legal communications from the past were not what they appeared to be. I know the family lawyer who handled our father's papers lied by omission, and I know the record of where my sister ended up went cold after her husband died. I know I hired people to search for her. And I know tonight, after finally receiving a reliable address, I arrived to find her standing in a kitchen with food at her feet and fear in her shoulders. That is already enough. Eleanor stared at him. So he had looked for her. The knowledge entered her almost painfully. All those years she had imagined herself forgotten by her only brother. He had been trying to find her. Vanessa's expression shifted. For the first time, uncertainty cracked the smoothness of her face. If you're here to cause a scene, I think you should leave. Alexander removed his overcoat slowly, with the controlled precision of a man refusing the temptation of fury. Then he stepped toward Eleanor and draped the coat over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar and winter air. The gesture was simple, but after years of being treated like an inconvenience, even that small act of care nearly undid her. He looked at her properly then, not as one examines damage, but as one tries to reassure someone that she is no longer alone inside it. "You're coming with me," he said. Eleanor swallowed. "Alexander." His eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. "Not another night here." Daniel found his voice again, but it came out strained. "Mom, you can't just leave like this." At that, Eleanor turned to him. For years, she had looked at her son through grief, excuse, maternal habit, and old love. But now something had cleared. What stood before her was not the little boy who once asked if she would still be there when he came home from school. That child was gone. In his place stood a grown man who had watched his mother reduced piece by piece and still chosen comfort over courage. "Like this?" she said quietly. "How else should I leave, Daniel? On my knees?" He flinched. Vanessa stepped in, anger returning now that fear had made her brittle. "This is absurd, after everything we've done for her." Alexander turned so sharply that even the security men near the door seemed to brace. "Do not make the mistake," he said, "of confusing control with generosity." Silence followed. Then, with the terrible dignity of someone who has nothing left to protect except her own self-respect, Eleanor bent, not to pick food from the floor, not to accept the place Vanessa had assigned her, but to set the dish towel gently on the counter and straighten her spine. She looked once around the house she had entered in grief and endured in silence. The polished staircase, the spotless marble, the cold flowers in their expensive vase. None of it looked grand anymore, only sterile, only small. Marta stepped forward and squeezed Eleanor's hand. "Go," she whispered. "Please." Eleanor nodded. Alexander offered his arm. For the briefest second, pride and pain warred inside her. Then she placed her hand on his sleeve, and together, brother and sister walked out of the house. The cold night air struck Eleanor's face like a wakening. The limousine waited under the glow of the entry lights, its door already open. One of the security men lowered his head respectfully as she approached. It was a level of dignity so ordinary in decent circumstances, and yet so absent from her life, that it nearly made her break down before she even crossed the driveway. At the threshold of the car, she turned once more. Daniel stood in the doorway, pale and motionless. Vanessa was just behind him, one hand gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Neither of them looked triumphant now. They looked stunned, as if the balance of power they had assumed permanent had shifted in a single night. Alexander spoke without raising his voice. "My sister is leaving with me tonight. From this moment on, you will never speak to her as though she were beneath you again."
Then he helped Eleanor into the limousine and closed the door. As the car began to move, the house receded behind dark glass. Eleanor sat very still, hands folded in Alexander's coat, not yet able to process the full shape of what had happened. Her life had broken open in one kitchen, then changed direction before midnight. Beside her, Alexander did not press her with questions. He simply waited until the house had vanished from view. Then, very softly, like a man ashamed of how many years had been lost, he said, "I am sorry it took me so long to find you."
And for the first time that night, Eleanor wept. Before we go on, tell me where you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. Some stories feel like warnings, others feel like comfort, and some, like this one, feel like the slow arrival of justice after years of silence. The first thing Eleanor noticed when she woke the next morning was the absence of fear. It was such a small thing, and yet so immense that for several seconds she did not even understand what felt different. She was lying in a bed far softer than the one in Daniel's house, beneath crisp white linens that smelled faintly of starch and cedar. Heavy cream curtains filtered the morning light into a muted gold. Somewhere beyond the walls, she could hear nothing harsher than distant birds and the faint clink of china. No one was stomping overhead. No one was opening and shutting cabinets with irritation. No one was waiting for her to rise so that she could once again become useful. For 6 years after Richard's death, and especially during the last 3 under Daniel's roof, Eleanor had lived in a state of quiet readiness, as if every day might require her to defend her right to occupy space. Now, for the first time in years, she woke not bracing herself, but breathing. Then memory came back all at once. The kitchen floor, Vanessa's voice, the limousine, Alexander. Eleanor sat up too quickly, and the room swayed. Before she could reach for the water on the bedside table, a discreet knock sounded at the door. "May I come in?" Alexander's voice asked. She had not heard that voice outside memory in 25 years, and still it held the same old undertone of impatient intelligence, only quieter now, age having sanded down some of its sharpness. "Yes," Eleanor said. He entered not as a magnate surveying property, but as a brother uncertain of his welcome. He wore a dark sweater and gray trousers instead of the severe coat from the night before, and in daylight she could see more clearly what time had done to him. The striking confidence remained, but grief had left its own architecture on his face. His eyes, once almost boyishly arrogant, now carried the fatigue of a man who had spent decades winning things that did not keep him warm. "I asked the doctor to come later this morning. Nothing dramatic, just a precaution." "A doctor?" "You were trembling last night, and you have been through more than enough." Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were steadier today, but only slightly. "I did not mean to fall apart in your car." Alexander's expression shifted. "You did not fall apart. You survived the moment long enough to get out of it." It was such a simple sentence, yet no one in her life, not Daniel, not Vanessa, not even kind outsiders, had spoken to her lately as though endurance itself was worthy of respect. A tray had already been set on the small table by the window. Tea, toast, soft eggs, sliced fruit, and marmalade in a silver dish. Eleanor stared at it with an emotion she was almost ashamed to name. Not hunger, not exactly, more like disbelief. Alexander noticed. "No one throws food at people in this house," he said quietly. The words landed between them with all the force of what he had seen. Eleanor turned her face away. For a few minutes they ate in near silence. It was not an easy silence, but neither was it hostile. It held the strange fragility of reunion between people who once loved each other fiercely, then lost half a lifetime to injury and pride. At last, Eleanor said, "You said last night that the legal communications from the past were not what they appeared to be." Alexander set down his cup. He expected the question. "Yes." "Then start there." He exhaled, long and slow, as if the story still carried poison. "When father died," he said, "I was already in Zurich most of the year. I knew there would be tensions over the estate, but I believed the solicitor, Harold Brenner, was handling matters fairly. You remember him?" Eleanor remembered him too well. Smooth, careful, always professionally sympathetic. He had looked people in the eye while withholding the truth. Alexander continued, "I wrote to you twice after the first set of papers arrived because something about the division looked wrong. I never heard back." Eleanor stared. "I never received any letters." His jaw tightened. "And I received 2 from you. Icy, formal, accusing me of trying to force a sale of the family land and cut you out. I wrote no such letters." "I know that now." The room seemed to narrow around the old wound. Eleanor leaned back slowly. All those years, she had imagined Alexander as cold, opportunistic, dazzled by money, and willing to use distance to seize whatever he wanted. Richard, protective and proud, had believed the same after the papers arrived. What had followed was not one explosive war, but something crueler, a misunderstanding fed carefully by paperwork, silence, and professional fraud until it hardened into estrangement. "What happened?" she asked. Alexander's mouth turned bitter. "Brenner died 11 years ago, but a junior partner from the firm came to me last year. He had found irregularities while reviewing archived files tied to several estate disputes. Our father's was one of them. Documents had been redirected, letters had not been sent, instructions had been paraphrased rather than delivered. He could not prove every motive, but he believed Brenner prolonged family conflict in certain cases because fractured heirs were easier to manipulate." Eleanor felt something close to nausea. "So, all this time?" "All this time," Alexander said. "We were both handed a version of the other person designed to produce resentment." She pressed her fingers to her mouth. 25 years. 25 years in which births, funerals, illnesses, birthdays, victories, and grief had all occurred without her brother, not because love had naturally died, but because someone had engineered absence, and pride had maintained it. Alexander looked at her carefully. "I should have come myself. I know that. I should not have trusted paper. I should not have let anger make me lazy." Eleanor lowered her hand. "And I should have doubted the ease with which I was made to believe the worst of you." Neither apology erased the lost decades, but truth entered the room like the first clean wind after a long illness. By the end of that week, Eleanor had been moved from Alexander's country estate outside London to a private suite in a medical wing he maintained through one of his philanthropic partnerships. He had insisted on a full health workup. Years of stress had not left her untouched. She was underweight, chronically sleep-deprived, mildly hypertensive, and carrying the sort of exhaustion doctors describe clinically, but families create personally. The physician, a calm woman named Dr. Beatrice Sloane, examined her without condescension. "You are not fragile, Mrs. Whitmore," she said after reviewing the results, "but you have been denied rest for far too long. Recovery is not indulgence, it is repair." Repair. Eleanor held on to that word. What she had expected from rescue, if rescue ever came at all, was relief. What she had not expected was structure. Alexander did not merely whisk her into luxury and then leave her to drift through gratitude. He began rebuilding the conditions of a life. A tailor came, not to dress her like a rich man's sister, but to replace clothing that no longer fit her shrunken frame. A therapist was offered, not imposed, after Alexander, to his credit, admitted he himself had spent years talking to professionals because wealth had solved many problems, but not his loneliness. A financial advisor, discreet and warm, met with Eleanor to explain that Alexander had set aside an independent trust in her name, one no son, daughter-in-law, or future opportunist could touch. "I do not want to live on charity," Eleanor told him when she learned the amount. Alexander actually smiled at that, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Then don't. Live on what should always have been family protection." Weeks passed, then months. Spring opened fully over England while Eleanor slowly returned to herself. She slept. She read novels she had not had the attention span for in years. She took slow walks along the gardens and learned the rhythms of a household run not by display, but by competence. The staff treated her with respect so matter-of-fact it almost hurt. A cook asked for her opinion on soup. The house manager checked whether the room temperature suited her. A driver waited patiently if she moved slowly. No one sighed. No one corrected her for existing. One rainy afternoon, Alexander found her in the library staring at the shelves. "What is it?" he asked. She gave a soft, embarrassed laugh. "I had forgotten what it feels like to be somewhere that does not require me to touching things by existing." He stood quietly with that for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do now?" The question startled her. Do? Yes. Not endure, not recover. Do. Eleanor had no immediate answer. For so long, life had shrunk to survival that the idea of purpose felt almost extravagant. Yet once the question had been asked, something dormant in her began to stir. "I used to love the library," she said. "Not only the books, the people. Children after school, women who came in just to sit somewhere warm and think, elderly men pretending to read newspapers when what they really wanted was company." Alexander leaned against the fireplace. "Go on." Eleanor looked out at the rain-dark lawn. "There are many kinds of hunger. Some are for food, yes, but some are for dignity, for learning, for a place to belong without being shamed. When Richard was principal, we used to talk about how many families were only one crisis away from falling apart: widowhood, illness, debt, shame. And once shame enters a house, it changes everything." Alexander said nothing. He was listening in the way only people with power and affection know how to listen when they are trying to turn pain into infrastructure. "What if," Eleanor said slowly, "there were places for women like that? Older women especially. Widows, discarded mothers, women who gave everything to raise other people and then found themselves treated like furniture once they were no longer economically useful. Not shelters, exactly. Something with books, legal guidance, meals served properly, with cloth napkins if possible, because she had come to understand that dignity was often communicated through small rituals, long before it was restored through policy." Alexander, accustomed to operating at enormous scale, seemed almost relieved to build something precise and human. During those same months, the world Daniel and Vanessa had curated in Connecticut began to tremble. It started with whispers. Wealthy circles were not moral, but they were ravenously curious. Someone had seen the limousine that night. Someone else had recognized Alexander Whitmore, whose business reputation in Europe had long since crossed the Atlantic.
Then came the quiet revelation that Eleanor had not merely disappeared after a family disagreement. She had re-emerged in London under the protection of a billionaire brother who had clearly not arrived by accident. Vanessa tried to control the narrative at first. Through friends, she hinted that Eleanor had always been unstable, that a distant relative had swept her up. Dramatically, that the family had done their best, but older people could become emotionally manipulative. The story might even have worked in some circles, if not for one crucial problem. Vanessa had spent years branding herself as a woman of compassion. And compassion, once contradicted by credible witnesses, makes hypocrisy smell particularly foul. Marta, still working in neighboring households and known to more people than Vanessa realized, did not gossip recklessly. But when directly asked whether Eleanor had been treated well, she did not lie. Others had seen enough themselves over the years to connect what they had politely ignored. A pattern emerged. The polished hostess image developed cracks. By the time the foundation prepared to launch its first American outreach partnership in New York, Eleanor was no longer merely Daniel's elderly mother whom people vaguely remembered from old gatherings. She was being introduced in philanthropic and legal circles as the chairwoman of an initiative serving vulnerable older women and low-income families on both sides of the Atlantic. When she first saw the draft press release, she almost laughed. "Chairwoman?" she said to Alexander. "That sounds absurd." "No," he replied, "it sounds overdue." A full year after the night of the kitchen floor, Eleanor stepped out of a black car, not a limousine this time, just a sensible sedan, outside a restored community building in Manhattan funded jointly by the foundation and two partner organizations. She wore a navy coat, pearl earrings Richard had once given her on their 20th anniversary, and a calm she had not possessed in decades. Cameras were modest, the event was not gaudy. That mattered to her. As she entered, she saw volunteers arranging books, attorneys preparing intake forms, and staff setting tables for the opening lunch. Everything smelled faintly of paper, soup, and fresh paint. Then, across the room, she saw Daniel. He had not been invited as family. He had requested, through proper channels, a chance to attend the launch and speak to her briefly. Alexander had left the decision entirely to Eleanor. Now, Daniel stood near the rear doorway in a dark suit that no longer seemed to fit him the way status once had. He looked thinner, older, though only a year had passed. Pride had drained from his face and left behind something raw. For a second, neither moved. Then Eleanor realized with a strange, solemn clarity that the balance had truly shifted. She was no longer the broken woman he had once expected to endure anything for the privilege of remaining near him. She stood inside a life built beyond his permission. And for the first time in years, when her son looked at her, he was the one who seemed unsure whether he had the right to come closer. Before we begin the final part of this story, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Some endings arrive like thunder, but others arrive like dawn, slowly, quietly, and with enough light to finally show what was worth saving. Daniel stood near the back of the Manhattan Community Building as though he had entered a church where he no longer knew whether he was welcome to pray. The year had not been kind to Daniel. His face was leaner, the confidence that had once seemed pressed into his features now stripped away. He looked like a man who had spent too long standing in the ruins of choices he could no longer blame on anyone else. Eleanor saw all this in a single glance, but what surprised her most was not his shame. It was the absence of resentment in herself. She did not feel tenderness exactly, and certainly not trust, but the old panic, the old instinct to soothe, excuse, rescue, was gone. That, more than the navy coat on her shoulders and the titles printed beneath her name on the launch program, was how she knew her life had truly changed. Daniel took a careful step toward her. "Mom?"
He had not called her that in person since the night she left. He had written letters over the past year, most of which Eleanor had read in silence and placed neatly in a drawer. Some were rambling and self-pitying, others were defensive. A few had seemed sincere, though sincerity after cowardice is hard to evaluate. She had replied only once, with a brief note stating that if they were ever to speak again, it would be in a public place connected to honest work rather than private guilt. Now, surrounded by volunteers unpacking donated books and staff preparing intake folders for elderly clients seeking legal help, Daniel seemed painfully aware of the symbolism. "You may speak to me for a few minutes," Eleanor said. "No more than that. The opening begins soon." He nodded. "Thank you." They moved toward a quieter corridor near the reading room. Through a glass panel, Eleanor could see children's shelves, soft chairs, and a long table where lunch would later be served, with cloth runners and proper plates. Every detail of the center had been deliberate. No one who came here would be handed dignity as an afterthought. Daniel followed her gaze. "It's beautiful." "It is useful," Eleanor replied. "Beauty matters too, but usefulness matters first." He gave a strained smile. "That sounds like something Dad would say." For the first time, Eleanor looked at him fully. "Your father would have said it with more courage." The sentence landed exactly as intended. Daniel lowered his head. "I deserve that," he said quietly. "Yes," Eleanor said, "you do." He drew a breath, as if steadying himself against the urge to retreat into self-defense. "I've spent the last year trying to understand how I became the kind of man who could stand there and do nothing." Eleanor said nothing. Daniel continued. "At first, I told myself it was fear of confrontation, then stress, then marriage, then pressure. But none of that explains it. The truth is uglier. I liked being comfortable. I liked being admired. I liked the life Vanessa built around me, even when I knew what it was costing other people. Every time Vanessa crossed a line with you, I chose the easier thing, and after enough choices like that," he swallowed, "it became who I was." Eleanor had expected apology. She had not expected precision. It did not forgive him, but it did make it harder to dismiss his remorse as performance. "What do you want from me?" she asked. He answered without hesitation. "Nothing immediate. I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness like it's a receipt to be issued once the right words are said. I only wanted to tell you that I see it now, not just what Vanessa did, what I did, or failed to do." Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. "Seeing is the minimum. Living differently is the test." He nodded. "I know." When the opening ceremony began, Daniel remained in the back row. He did not approach Alexander, who stood off to one side with the detached vigilance of a brother who had no intention of interfering unless necessary. He did not speak to the press. He did not try to insert himself into the Foundation's story. He simply stayed and listened while Eleanor took the podium for the first time in her new role. She had been nervous until the moment she saw the audience. They were not socialites hunting prestige. They were widows, retired teachers, immigrant mothers, social workers, clergy, public defenders, donors with serious faces, and elderly women who had known some version of neglect in their own lives. Many of them did not need a perfect speech. They needed truth. So Eleanor gave them truth. She spoke of hidden humiliations, of the false belief that old age should be grateful for scraps, of how easy it is for society to notice dramatic abuse while ignoring the slow erosion of dignity inside respectable homes. She spoke of books, meals, legal guidance, and the necessity of places where people are not made to feel expensive simply because they still need care. The cruelest hunger, she said near the end, her voice steady over the microphone, is not always for food. Sometimes it is the hunger to be treated as fully human in the place where you ought to be loved most. We built this center so that no one who walks through its doors will be spoken down to, hidden away, or taught to apologize for needing kindness. The applause that followed did not sound like pity, it sounded like recognition. Afterward, Daniel approached her only long enough to say, "I didn't know you could speak like that." Eleanor met his eyes. "That is because you stopped listening long before I stopped having a voice." The months after the launch were difficult in ways that had nothing to do with foundation work and everything to do with consequences. Vanessa's world was collapsing. What had begun as whispering discomfort among her social contacts turned into something more dangerous when financial irregularities inside one of her lifestyle ventures were formally examined. Eleanor learned the details gradually, not through gossip but through Alexander's lawyers, who insisted on keeping her informed only when matters intersected with Daniel's liability. Vanessa had used the credibility of her charity network and Daniel's legal reputation to reassure investors about a hospitality and branding company that had been bleeding money for years. There were hidden accounts, misleading statements, and eventually questions about signatures attached to documents Daniel claimed he had never fully reviewed. "Did he sign them?" Eleanor asked Alexander one evening in London as they sat in the drawing room after dinner. Alexander closed the file in front of him. "Some, yes. Others may have been signed electronically without meaningful disclosure. That is what comes of letting another person run both your conscience and your calendar." Eleanor stared into the fire. "He was weak." "Yes," said Alexander, "but weakness in the service of vanity often becomes complicity." Daniel separated from Vanessa before the year was out, not with dramatic shouting, not with broken glass, but with the dead exhaustion of two people whose marriage had been built on mutual ambition and could not survive exposure. He filed for divorce after discovering the extent of the concealed debt, and after one final unforgivable revelation. Vanessa had attempted to preemptively move assets and position him as the primary legal shield if the investigation worsened. "She said we had to protect the life we built," Daniel later told Eleanor during one of their tightly structured meetings. And what life was that? The one made of favors, appearances, and silence? He had no answer. Eleanor did not rescue him. That was perhaps the greatest difference between the woman she had once been and the woman she had become. Years earlier, she would have sold another piece of herself to keep her son from consequences. Now she imposed conditions. If Daniel wanted any support, not financial but human, he would first have to tell the truth publicly where necessary, cooperate fully with investigators, withdraw from any dishonest claims, begin therapy, and offer unpaid legal service through the Foundation's Elder Advocacy Program for as long as its board deemed appropriate. When Alexander heard the conditions, he raised an eyebrow in quiet respect. "You are sterner than I remember." "I am later in life than you remember," Eleanor replied. Daniel accepted. The work broke him open more than shame had. 3 afternoons a week, under supervision, he assisted attorneys handling elder neglect cases, fraudulent property transfers, guardianship abuse, and abandonment disputes. He read affidavits from frightened widows whose children had emptied bank accounts.
He met men in nursing facilities who had not seen family in years. He helped draft protective petitions for women who had been bullied out of homes they once paid for. One evening, after a long clinic day in Boston, Daniel sat across from Eleanor in the foundation office and said hoarsely, "I used to think cruelty had to look dramatic to count. I didn't understand what repeated contempt can do to a person." Eleanor arranged papers on her desk before answering. "No, you only understood when you began seeing yourself in the file."
He accepted that too. Redemption, if it came at all, came without fanfare. Over the next 3 years, Daniel rebuilt his legal career modestly, working with a smaller practice focused on estate ethics and elder advocacy. The newspapers lost interest. Society moved on to fresher scandals. Vanessa disappeared from the circles that had once applauded her. There were rumors she relocated to Miami, then to Monaco, then back to New York under a different version of herself. Eleanor never checked which rumor was true. Some people do not deserve permanent residence in one's mental home. The foundation grew. A second center opened in Boston, then a coastal outreach program in Maine. Scholarships were established in Richard Whitmore's name for students entering public education and library sciences. Mobile legal clinics served rural communities where older women often fell through every available crack. Eleanor traveled more than she had in the entire decade before Richard's death, though always carefully and always with the kind of scheduling that allowed her room to remain human rather than ceremonial. Eventually, at Alexander's insistence, and with her own long-delayed longing, she bought a house on the coast of Maine. It was not a mansion. That mattered. Eleanor did not want scale, she wanted peace. The house sat on a bluff above a gray-blue stretch of Atlantic water, with hydrangeas near the porch, and a reading room facing east so that morning light could spill across the floorboards. There was a fireplace big enough for winter evenings, a kitchen built for actual cooking rather than display, and shelves lined with novels, biographies, atlases, and children's books, donated in part by the Foundation's literacy partners. On certain Saturdays, local children from the program came for reading afternoons. They arrived in muddy boots and bright jackets, carrying questions and appetites. Eleanor would serve soup, biscuits, and apple slices, then read aloud while gulls wheeled outside over the sea. Sometimes Daniel came too, helping stack chairs afterward, washing dishes without being asked, leaving quietly once the work was done. Trust never returned to what it had once been. Some broken things are mended into new shapes rather than restored to their original form. Eleanor no longer mistook biological closeness for moral safety. But over time, Daniel became someone she could speak to without tightening in anticipation. He called regularly and did not demand intimacy as payment for improvement. He listened more. He interrupted less. He learned, finally, that remorse is proved through consistency, not speeches. Alexander visited often, usually with too much work in his briefcase and not enough rest in his face. Yet at the main house he seemed to age backward by 5 years. He and Eleanor would sit on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching weather move over the water while correcting each other's memories about childhood. Sometimes they argued about trivial things: who cheated at cards, who broke their mother's blue vase, who had truly started the final shouting match before the old estate disaster. These arguments were gifts. Ordinary sibling quarrels are one of the great luxuries of people who have not lost each other. "You know," Alexander said one autumn evening, while the sea below turned to pewter under the setting sun, "when I first found you, I thought the great act of repair would be taking you away from that house." Eleanor smiled faintly. "And?" He looked out toward the horizon. "That was only extraction. Repair was everything after." She considered that.
Yes, rescue can happen in one night, recovery takes architecture. He laughed softly. That sounds like something we should put in the annual report. Absolutely not, she said. It would make us sound unbearable.
They were in Boston together the year the foundation hosted its largest gala yet, not a gaudy spectacle, but a serious fundraising evening to expand elder dignity programs across New England. The ballroom was elegant without being vulgar. At Eleanor's insistence, the menu was excellent and served with genuine care. No one would leave hungry. No one would be made to feel ornamental. Daniel attended as a guest and volunteer liaison, not as featured family. That, too, mattered. When the evening reached its final address, Eleanor walked to the podium amid warm applause. She was 75 now. Her hair was silver, her posture still graceful, and her voice stronger than anyone who had seen her on that kitchen floor years ago could have imagined. She looked out across the room at donors, staff, widows, librarians, attorneys, teachers, volunteers, Alexander seated near the front, Daniel farther back with quiet eyes, and understood with full clarity that her life had not been saved merely so she could enjoy comfort. It had been reopened so she could build something from the ruins. She did not tell the whole story. Some humiliations are not owed to public curiosity. But she told enough. There was a time, she said, when I believed my life had narrowed beyond recovery. I thought dignity, once denied long enough, became something a person could no longer ask for without sounding foolish. I was wrong. Dignity is not a luxury good. It is not reserved for the wealthy, the young, or the socially useful. It belongs equally to the widow, the abandoned parent, the tired worker, the frightened child, the aging man no longer visited, the woman who has been made to feel like an inconvenience in her own family. The room was silent. She rested one hand lightly on the edge of the podium. And the greatest miracle of my life was not that a limousine arrived one night when I thought the worst of my story had already been written. The greatest miracle was learning that after humiliation, after grief, after being discarded by people I once would have died for, I could still build a future no one could drag back onto the floor. This time, the applause rose slowly, then all at once. Afterward, as guests stood and the sound rolled through the ballroom like weather breaking, Eleanor looked toward Alexander. He did not clap at first. He simply looked at her the way brothers look when the family they thought was lost has somehow returned in a stronger form. Then he stood. So did Daniel. And for the first time in many years, Eleanor did not feel like the abandoned mother of a failed son, or the widow of a quiet good man, or the humiliated woman from a rich house kitchen. She felt like herself, fully, finally, and without permission. When the evening ended, she returned not to anyone else's home, but to the life she had chosen. And that, at last, was enough.